Hello, everybody. If you have not joined us for a Tuesday talk yet, I'm Britin Bostick. I'm the Georgetown downtown and historic planner, and joining me is my excellent and valued colleague, Ann Evans, reference librarian with the award-winning Georgetown Public Library. So we have the incredible privilege every month of coming to you on the first Tuesday and talking about Georgetown's history, things that we find interesting and valuable to share so that you can understand better why we love our historic resources and how our community came to be. We celebrated Black History Month last month and really enjoyed our conversation with our special guest, Paulette Taylor. So if you didn't catch us live or if you haven't seen the video yet, you can go to historic.georgetown.org, and that video is linked right there on the front page for Black History Month. Ms. Taylor's story is incredible. The stories that she shared about growing up in Georgetown were really wonderful and also just really eye-opening if you're not familiar with the stories of communities in color in Georgetown, and especially our Track Ridge Grasshopper neighborhood, our historic African-American neighborhood that's just to the west of our downtown. So really great opportunity to learn there and to catch up to our Black History Month celebration. This month is Women's History Month. It's also Texas Independence Day for everybody who's celebrating. So we thought we'd have a couple of Texas women talk to you about some more Texas women and share with you some stories about Georgetown's early 20th century female real estate developers. If you are not aware that women have been involved in real estate development in Georgetown since the early years, we have some surprises for you and wanted to share stories about women we have very clear records of who either as widows or as heirs of their parents' estates and fortunes, leveraged that really successfully into real estate development in different ways throughout their lifetimes. And so some really good stories to share today. And these are women who in some points of their lives were really prominent members of the community, and also women who may not have been quite as connected. And so really important to share those stories, especially as some of the houses that they built are no longer standing, but thankfully we've got some historic photos to share. We're trying to bring it back. So the women that we want to talk about today, Katherine Hudson, Maddie Cody, Lily Douglas, who has one of the longest names that I've ever come across in research, and then Elizabeth Glasscock, who some people knew as Elizabeth Talbot toward the later part of her life, but I'm pretty sure she was most well known as Elizabeth Glasscock, the oldest daughter and second child of Georgetown's founder, George W. Glasscock. And so we'll get started with Katherine Hudson because she was really the first woman that I was able to identify in my work with the city as a real estate developer. And it may not be on the scale that we think of today. A lot of times when we think of real estate development, we think of commercial developments. She wasn't doing commercial, she was doing residential. And it turns out she developed almost an entire city block that has a business on it today that you'll probably recognize if you're very familiar with our Old Town Historic District. So she was probably, so this is where research gets fun. This is where I also lean on Ann a lot for her expertise. But sometimes when we're looking at names might get spelled differently in different public documents. You would think, well, a name is a name. Well, sometimes it's the same and sometimes it's spelled very differently. So we have seen her spelled Katherine with a K and an A. I've also seen her name as Jean Katherine Crutcher. She's also gone by Kate, different spellings of Katherine, and these are all in public documents as well as cemetery records. So we think we're talking about all the same lady here. She was married kind of earlier on in her life to a man named Joseph Hudson. And then cemetery records for the International Oddfellows Cemetery here in Georgetown. So it's kind of tucked back behind Southwestern University to the northeast. You can go all the way down 7th Street, and 7th Street kind of dead ends into the IOOF cemetery. We have a lot of notable Georgetownians buried there. So those cemetery records have Joseph Allen Hudson and Jean Katherine Crutcher Hudson buried together. And they also seem to have had a son who died early in his infancy. And so Katherine lost her son, her newborn son, and her husband in kind of a very close time period. So within a couple of years, she lost her family, which you can understand would have been a really tragic circumstance. But she kept on and, in fact, stayed in Georgetown And it looks like her brother-in-law, her husband's brother, helped her to buy a house. And so she owned property and then developed the block that she lived on. I have found records showing that she may have been in Bell County by 1937, but it looks like she was in Round Rock in Georgetown for quite some time. And then as a single lady real estate developer, she was in Georgetown. So she bought the west half of Block 1 from the Sweet family in 1916 for a pretty large sum of money at that time, $2,450. And so the area on the Sanborn map from 1916 we've got highlighted, that's the half of the block that she owned. If you're looking at the streets, you're seeing the intersection of University Avenue and Walnut Street. So if you know where Gus's Drug is, that's exactly what we're looking at. She had a house where Gus's Drug's parking lot is today, if you can believe that. And it would have been a pretty large house. We're looking at a one-story dwelling that's got a pretty large footprint, a very large yard. It's showing a servant's quarters behind the house and then some outbuildings back along 13th Street, which used to be called Palmetto. So she bought a pretty substantial bit of property. And I'm not clear on whether her brother-in-law assisted her financially or just assisted her with the transaction. But the Sweet family had been a pretty large family who ultimately moved out of Georgetown and moved on to Arizona and Oklahoma after selling this house to her. And so the house it seems to have been built in 1896 by Robert and Maggie John. And so this wasn't the house that she built, but it's the block that she began to acquire. So this is where she lived in a really great part of Old Town, pretty close to Southwestern University, which would have been kind of newly built at that point in time. Southwestern's buildings that we admire so much today would have been kind of brand new. We see on the Sanborn map from 1925 that there are a lot more houses on this block by this point, but all facing onto University Avenue. So where you see 12th Street, that's University. So she built all of these houses except for the one on the far right, I believe. And so she took her big lot, she bought some more of the block, and then she kind of divided it and built additional houses for other people to live in. She kind of created her own next door neighbors. That would have been a way for her to earn income. She either could have built those houses and kept them as rental property or selling them. It looks like for the most part, she built houses and then sold them. The reason that we know she built those houses is when we look at the earlier deed records, a lot of times we can see the value that the land was transferred for or what people were paying for land. And that usually gives us a pretty clear picture of whether there was property on that or not. And so in one instance, she sold a part of the block just as the land and somebody else built the house. And then in some cases, she was building a house herself. So this 1940 map, you can see some blurrier, kind of unclear outlines on the bottom half of the block, on the south half. Those were actually houses that were built by 1940. And we know in particular, she built the one on the left. It's really hard to see. I apologize for that. Well, we actually have a photo we can show you, but in 1928, so after the previous map, but before this map, she took out a building loan for $3,500 to construct a house that was facing Walnut Street. And then she may have been making other improvements. That was a pretty substantial loan. That was probably a bigger loan than she needed just to build that one house based on the size of it. And so then she sold the southwest quarter of the block, including that house that she built, to a family last name Johnson for $1,200 in 1936. She kept a 10-foot wide alley, though, on the north side of the property that she sold to get to her own property. So her driveway was not off of University. Her driveway came off of Walnut, and she retained that 10 feet so that she could get her car over there, it looks like. And then she finally sold her house, the big house that she had initially bought from the Sweet family, in 1944 for $4,500. So it's really fun to kind of see what the amounts were at that point in time and kind of get a better sense. So this is Katherine Hudson's block. Some familiar landmarks that you're seeing in the background. The historic Georgetown High School, built in the 1920s. If you saw our talk on schools last fall, then we talked about that building quite a bit, that campus, and all the changes that have happened there. That's the Hammerlin Center for GISD nowadays. And so this is her block. So if you're used to going to Gus's Drug, have seen Gus's Drug, they've got this beautiful red poppy art mural on the side of it now that you may have seen or even taken a photo with. that is where her house was and where the houses were that she built. And so the one that we're talking about that she built with that building loan that she had gotten is kind of the house that's, you can kind of see the gable end or the triangle end and two windows that are kind of facing us. It's facing onto what's now Walnut Street, kind of in the middle of that block, but kind of facing away. So that is the house for sure that I know she built. And it looks like she probably built at least one, probably two others. I think she built the houses on either side of her as well. And then these houses kind of facing onto 12th Street, or sorry, 13th Street. And then the house on the far right corner, those would have been built by somebody else, it looks like. And so the house is no longer there. There's a new house there that was recently built. But if you, thankfully, Google Street View sometimes lets us go back in time a little bit. So we have a little bit of a picture of the house that Katherine Hudson built. I wanted to be able to show that to y'all since it's her house is now gone. And so over time, and you may be wondering, well, why did her houses disappear? You know, what happened to those? Why would people have replaced those with other buildings, other structures? It wasn't that uncommon at the time, you know, and this would have been kind of the middle of the 20th century. It wouldn't have been that uncommon. We weren't really invested in historic preservation at that point. So people were changing sites and changing uses to fit their needs. The Georgetown Hospital developed kind of kitty corner from her block. And so there was a need to have a pharmacy there. There was a bigger need for a pharmacy than there was for a house. And so the houses were demoed to make way for kind of this new little commercial node in Old Town that was closer than having to go all the way to the downtown. We think it's not very far today, but back then a lot more people were walking. And so people were just making adjustments in their neighborhood as they needed and in a way that made sense to them. And so that's why some of those are no longer with us. So we see a lot of those changes over time. And then nowadays, we work to protect a lot of the historic structures we have with us now because they also help to bring the stories of our community. So a little bit of information about Katherine Hudson and kind of a fun story for me to tell because she was the first woman that I was able to research having done kind of this work. And from what I can tell, she never remarried. And so this was work that she all did. She did all of this herself as an independent lady. And so here today, we do have a couple of the homes remaining from the time that she lived here. And so you can see a couple of those really wonderful little houses with craftsman details, kind of the asymmetric facades, some beautiful window, and we call the little support pieces under the eaves, we call brackets. That's pretty typical of houses from the 19-teens, 1920s period in those craftsman elements. So our next female real estate developer has a pretty big story, but she was part of a pretty well-known family. This is Martha Rebecca, known as Maddie Hughes, who married Dr. Claude Carr Cody, who is really, really well known at Southwestern. In fact, one of the most beautiful kind of memorial writings or writings in honor of someone are in one of the Southwestern yearbooks from way back, and kind of thanking, I think it was actually shortly after Dr. Cody passed in 1923, kind of memorializing him and his role in Southwestern. And it's just a really beautiful writing in the yearbook that spoke
referred
about
to as the grand old man.
The grand old man of Southwestern. So he was so well known, and I did not know that his wife actually was quite the business person in her own right. And so he passed in 1923. She didn't pass until 1953, 30 years later. And they had 3 sons together. And so he, had this great reputation at Southwestern and was instrumental in so much of the progress of that university, especially because he was in administration and was there for so long. The Cody Memorial Library is named after him. But it turns out that she was quite an heiress in her own right. Her father was a judge. He was Thomas Hughes, who was kind of instrumental in earlier Georgetown history. And I'd asked Ann for this. I said, Ann, do you have a picture of his house? Because I believe he had one of the largest houses in Georgetown, maybe ever. It was a pretty substantially sized structure. And And it turns out that Maddie Cody tore her father's house down and sold his property for redevelopment. So let's get into that.
He was getting into the money.
She was widowed and was going to make a living for herself, and it looks like also provided to a great extent for her sons, who I believe she had a lot of descendants go on into the medical profession and be really successful there. So when we look at early land development in Georgetown, there's often a plat associated with it. If you're not familiar with a plat is what lays out lots and blocks and streets, oftentimes what size they are, what shape they are, where they're located. Today's plats, we still do this. We did this back then and we do this now. So this is still part of the development process. We usually have a lot more detail on plats today, but at the time, she wrote this plat and laid out Cody's subdivision. And so when you see Cody's subdivision, that's a name that's often associated with men. And so it's really easy to think like Cody's subdivision would have been platted and developed by a man. But no, this was Maddie or Martha Cody's subdivision. So after her father passed away, she seems to inherited, and she had siblings, so I'm not sure how she got this, but she inherited her father's massive block where basically his estate had been. It was several city blocks today, is kind of the size, and he just had his big old house on it. And she and her sister lived next door directly to the east. We'll show you those photos in a little bit. But she divided up her father's property, tore down his house, and then sold all of these lots between Church Street and Myrtle Street. And if you're looking for a point of reference, if you look up there at the corner of University and Church on the top left, you'll see blocks 1 and 2, a number 1 and a number 2 in the rectangular shapes. That's where Tony and Luigi's restaurant is today. So if you're trying to understand where is this, start at Tony and Luigi's and then head south along Church Street or Myrtle Street, where we've got some beautiful historic structures that we really kind of cherish and value in our Old Town Overlay District. But she seems to have written this whole thing out, filed it with the county, and established Cody's subdivision. And so we see it on the Sanborn fire insurance maps. These are a great reference source for us. These are all online, which makes it really helpful for anybody who wants to do a little bit more looking and understand a little bit better how all this works. But we can see in the 1916 map there on the left, it's a big 2-story house, stone in front, wood structure behind. It has big 2-story porches. I looked at this house and went, this must have been quite a house, because that is a really big footprint to have 2 stories kind of at this point in time. And I knew because it was Thomas Hughes's house, it would have been built earlier on, but Anne actually had a lot better information than I did. And you said this started in the Civil War.
So it actually started before the Civil War, because they were doing the second floor when the war kind of broke out. And then shortly thereafter, Thomas Proctor Hughes actually was one of the people that voted against secession. They're called the 7 Against Secession. But he still ended up joining the Confederate Army, like most men in Georgetown, in Williamson County. And so he went off to war. During the war itself, his wife is at home with an unfinished second story. No one's there to really be able to work on it and do any carpentry work on it or anything like that. And suddenly a yellow fever epidemic breaks out in Georgetown, and there wasn't enough wood, at least enough prepared wood, for the coffins. So she actually donated some of the second floor building materials from their house for coffins during the Civil War. So an interesting kind of morbid history to that house a little.
That's really wild. So they took part of the house's building materials, used them to make coffins because of the yellow fever epidemic. And then I guess after he got back and
they
things
finished it,
began to kind of return to normal business, they were able to finish the house. And that's the house that we see in 1916.
yes.
And then, so by 1925, that's the center photo. You see that big house, and some of the outbuildings have disappeared. And that is now just kind of an open block. And then in the map on the far right, you start to see some buildings appear right up there along East 12th Street. Again, that's University Avenue or Highway 29 as we know it today. But back then it would have been East 12th Street. we still were going, a lot of streets still had numbers instead of names at that point in time. And so that's when we see, so it's between 1925 and 1940 that we see this redevelopment activity really start to occur. And I had said, Anne, do you have any idea if we have a picture of this house? I think this house must have been really grand. And as always, you did not disappoint. But what is going on in this photo?
What is happening here is a celebration of the Centennial of America. So in 1876, much like the bicentennial, there were tons of events and parties across the country in celebration of the centennial. So this is a centennial party that was hosted by the Hughes, and everyone was required to come in Revolutionary garb. So they had these elaborate costumes made. So these are people in the 1870s dressing up like people in the 1770s. So people don't really change too much. And so this is a party at the Hughes. We think that Thomas is kind of there towards the center in that white powdered wig. And they actually had these elaborate vests and costumes made. And the Williamson Museum actually does have a couple of those vests still from the Hughes family that just have this intricate embroidery that were likely made for this party.
That's incredible. I'm also looking at, so I knew from the Sanborn map that this was, at least the front portion of the house was stone. This is a really substantial structure. I'm looking at a huge double front door with windows on, side lights and a transom above, this huge ornamental kind of trim around the door, big windows with shutters, these big stone columns for the front porch, big front steps. I mean, we can only see a little picture of this house, but even back in 1876, this was a really prominent structure. And so it makes me that much more amazed that Maddie Cody tore this house down to redevelop the property. And I'm not sure if I'm ever going to get over my surprise at that. So Southwestern University Special Collections is a great partner for us. They have got some wonderful photographic resources, and they're currently working on digitizing photos from Preservation Georgetown's collection. So a lot of people are working really hard behind the scenes to help us have better access to some of these photos as we do our research. And hopefully you can find ways to explore their collection online. They have a wonderful digital archive. The Southwestern yearbooks that we talked about are all digitized and they're available to view online. That is a really fun research rabbit hole to fall down if you have the time. Even if you don't, I've really enjoyed looking at that. But this photo does come from one of their collections, and it's from around 1934. Somebody flew over Georgetown in an airplane, took a lot of photos, and I was glad that we could see. So in 1934, I said between 1925 and 1940, Maddie Cody was redeveloping this block. We know she filed the plat in 1925. She was ready to subdivide and sell. And so we can see this kind of big open stretch of grass that you can see right in the middle of the photo. That was her block that she was selling off to be redeveloped. And the two properties at the very front were kind of this front corner. I believe it was a grocery store, maybe gas station, kind of multi-use commercial purpose. And then the structure you can see on the left of that block, that was actually an apartment building with a couple of different buildings. It was almost in kind of a Spanish style, if you will. Flat roofs, white stucco, some red tile. That's no longer there either. That's a parking lot now. And then, as I said, the building that was the grocery store actually became what we know today as Tony and Luigi's restaurant. So the next time you're over in this part of Old Town, think about how interesting the evolution of this property has been. And then we can see in this 1964 aerial photo of Georgetown, by 1964, all of those lots that she had created in her plat had been developed with new houses. And so in 1964, these were new houses in our Old Town. Now that we're in 2021, these are historic homes that we kind of value as part of our historic district. But it looks like all of her hard work as a real estate developer really panned out, and this was all developed. And today, you would never know that Thomas Hughes used to have a big old house on his own huge block just off the square in Georgetown. So this is, she lived right there. I kind of mentioned earlier, but just wanted to circle back on that. She lived there right next door to her husband. So if you've ever wondered about the history of these beautiful homes on University, this is kind of between Tony and Luigi's and the First United Methodist Church. If you've wondered about that big, gorgeous white house, that was her sister's house. That was her sister Louetta's house, she and her husband. And then Martha and her husband, Dr. Cody, lived in the greenhouse, if you've seen it. So the sisters lived right next door to each other. It looks like their whole lives, and at least as adults and as married women, but they had very different house styles. And so next time you drive there, just kind of think about Louetta and Martha and the Hughes family and the wonderful evolution that has been the properties that they had. This is one of my favorite stories, just because, again, I can't believe she tore her father's massive house down. And that is something that I would have loved to have today. You know, sometimes we think about losing historic structures as a very modern thing. She had torn her father's house down by 1925. So that was almost 100 years ago that we lost that house. I say lost, you know, it wasn't mine to lose, but I really would, if anybody is aware of a photo of that house where you can see more than the porch, we're very interested to see that photo, because I would love to see how grand that house would have been, as befitting her father, the judge and legislator. So our next lady is Lilburn Angeline Dimmitt Atkinson Eubank Douglas. If you watched our Tuesday talks where we talked about the moved house mystery, this is the woman who is part of the moved house mystery. We talked about a house on Main Street that had been moved over to 4th Street. The top and bottom had been separated and made into 2 separate houses. This house came from the block where the Piggly Wiggly was. The man who was part of that transition from Piggly Wiggly to HEB, and then HEB moved from the downtown off to I-35, which is kind of newly constructed. So she is part of that story, and not only part of that story, but part of the story of a very prominent building in our downtown that I really love the style of. So she was the daughter of Philip Dimmitt and Amanda Shell. So if you've heard of the Shell family, Shell Road, lots of Shells, and so her mother was a Shell. Philip Dimmitt was John Dimmitt's son, I believe, and the Dimmitts had a lot of property in Georgetown. You've seen their names on buildings in Georgetown for a good reason. And so she was born in 1889 and lived to be almost 100 years old. She had quite a life and was very long living, but she had a sister who died very young, and her mother died also. It looks like she may have died during or around childbirth. And so her father didn't live that much longer. And so she was a young orphan who was also the heiress of quite a bit of real estate and wealth. And so she had a guardian, a friend of her father's was kind of the guardian of her estate until she came of age. But really some kind of tragic circumstances early in her life, and then continued. So she married her first husband, Charles Byron Atkinson, in 1909. But he kind of tragically died in 1920 due to an illness. And it seems that both of them may have been ill around the same time. And she, I think, actually had to convalesce in San Antonio for a period of time. It was a long recovery. And you and I talked about this, whether or not that could have been Spanish flu, trying to understand the timeline of their illness. So we're currently still kind of in the COVID pandemic situation. A lot of references have been made to the Spanish flu pandemic in the 1918, 1919 time period. And so we're not sure what the nature of their illness was. And you said it could have been a lot of other things as well.
It could have been a lot of other things. It could have just been the ordinary flu. But much like we've seen the waves with COVID, waves of Spanish flu did keep rippling through for a couple of years. We think of the big waves really as that late 1918, early 1919 period, but there were different kind of waves of it that came through at different times. But of course, at that time, there's also a lot of other illnesses that we didn't have the same treatments that we do now, especially mosquito-borne illnesses in this area. So we really don't have a full way of understanding what it might have been.
So Unfortunately, she lost her first husband kind of earlier on in her life and in their relationship. But about 4 years later, she married into the Eubank family. And the Eubanks were the owners of our house that was the subject of our move, House Mystery. And so that's how she became related to that house, is through her second husband, who was nicknamed Rex. And then he passed in 1951, and then she married David Fulton Douglas. And so survived 3 husbands and then kept on going. And so the building downtown that was her building, and I think this is important. This is considered the Philip Dimmitt building, Philip Dimmitt and Company. He did not live very long after this building was constructed. So this was actually the Lilburn Dimmitt building. For most of its life, this building was actually owned and operated by her, his daughter. And so if you're a little bit like, wait, where is this building? This is a little bit older photo because we didn't have trees in the way when this photo was taken. Our lovely oaks and crepe myrtles downtown sometimes obscure building facades, so I like to show them as well as I can. This is where Century 21 now offices. If you're kind of going, what building is that? It's at the corner of 8th and Main Streets. And so this was her building, like I said, for the great part of her life and of this building's life. And I think that's really kind of amazing. And so a lot of interesting business occurred in this building. It was dry goods. It was a drugstore. It's now a real estate office. It's been many other things over its lifetime. And we've also got a couple of really fun photos over time. Sometimes the black and whites are really fun because they really show off the detail beautifully. This is a really handsome limestone building with some really wonderful detail. And like I said, you've got the Dimmitt name on it. So next time you see this building, it was built in 1901. So she was about 10 years old when this was built, 12 years old when this was built. So when you see P.H. Dimmitt's name on it, just remember that it was actually Lily's building. She has another connection that is interesting to people who are familiar with Georgetown's history. Charles Belford built this house for she and her first husband. And so we have a Belford National Register Historic District. And a lot of times Charles Belford is associated with Victorian homes, like these really gorgeous Victorian style homes. Belford's own house was a Victorian with a lot of detail and ornamentation. But the Atkinsons were very modern. And so they had Belford build them a prairie style or craftsman style home. You can think Frank Lloyd Wright would have been a popular architect, kind of a leading figure coming up at this point in time. We're kind of moving into a lot of the details that you'll see in a lot of other properties in our Old Town Overlay District. So some people aren't familiar because we associate Belford with Victorian, that he also did a lot of craftsman homes. And this is kind of a really unique and an exemplary example of that style. And so that was over on Walnut Street. So that's kind of back a little bit to the east of the Hammerlin Center campus. And if you're wondering, well, like, why did she live over there instead of closer to downtown? She clearly had a lot of business interest over there. Her father had the Dimmitt Edition. This house is in the Dimmitt Edition. So this is actually built on her family's property that they also subdivided and sold. And so if you can think her father, so we talked about Maddie Cody having a subdivision that she kind of divided the land and then sold off. Lilburn would have inherited her father's property that would have been for that residential development. And so we've got examples of women kind of inheriting this property that they're then kind of leveraging into kind of a successful real estate business, buying and selling land, maybe buying and selling buildings and properties. So the house that she had with her second husband, and where it appears that she did live at least part of the time, a little bit hard to tell, but we think she may have, is this house that was right behind the elementary school. So if you've been very familiar with Tuesday Talks and seen our presentations before, you've probably seen this photo. It's one of my very favorites. This is from that 1934 collection that is kind of on borrow to us from Southwestern Special Collections. Huge thanks to them for helping us out. But the big school that you're seeing right in front is where Dos Salsas and Wells Fargo and the oil exchange are today. And so the house that we're talking about is this house right behind it. So this was her husband's family's house. And it seems that they had this house for quite a while, especially during their marriage. It was this beautiful two-story and it was kind of an early Victorian. This house, it turns out, was built about 1886. And so Preservation Georgetown did some excellent research. Huge thanks to Liz Weaver for joining us. And then it became Dana's house over on 4th Street once the house was moved and then divided in half. And so Dana's house is the bottom half of this house, and then the top half is right next door to her over on 4th Street. So Elizabeth Jane Glasscock Logan Talbot, I'm going for all the long names. This is a woman who is really kind of a big deal in Georgetown's history, not only because of her family, but because of herself. And so at the very beginning, right before we got started, Ann and I were talking about where she would have been born. And where do you, based on, she was born in 1841. So where do you think she was born?
We think she was probably born in Bastrop County. That's where her father and family had moved to. They kind of made their way here. George Washington Glasscock, if you're unfamiliar with him, he is Georgetown's namesake. He's the one that donated the land for the county seat, as long as they named it after him. And I'm personally glad it's Georgetown and not Glasscockville or something like that. He's sort of a larger than life figure. So he starts off in Kentucky, moves to Illinois, is in the Black Hawk War there, supposedly operates a barge business with Abraham Lincoln. Ends up coming to Texas, starts practicing law, gets involved with the Texas Revolution, is in the Siege of Behar, which is one of the earliest big battles in the Texas Revolution, or campaigns, I should say. So he starts working his way westward after the Revolution. So by 1840-ish, he's in Bastrop County. A few years after that, he's in Travis County, and then he ends up in Williamson County by 1848, and he owns quite a bit of land up here, and he is able to donate the 172 acres to form Georgetown.
This is kind of competing with anything I've ever heard about Davy Crockett. So we have this like larger than life figure, which we haven't talked. We referenced George Washington Glasscock a lot as the founder of Georgetown, the namesake of Georgetown, but we don't often talk about his like really exciting life, or at least the myth of his really exciting life. And you know, as we go through time, and this was the Wild West, absolutely at that point in time. But I like that his legend is kind of, for me, kind of on par with what we hear about Davy Crockett. And especially because it's got ties to the Texas Revolution. Here we are in Texas Independence Day. So we wanted to share that with y'all. And he and his wife had several children. And Elizabeth was their second child and oldest daughter, I believe. And she kind of kept up with the family the family energy, if you will. These were people who were really movers and shakers early on in Texas history. And her father had a substantial amount of wealth, not only the land, but also he really successfully kind of turned that into financial resources. He had a lot of really high level relationships. And so something that's really interesting to me about Elizabeth is that she married a man who I've seen in records as Lon Logan, which I think is short for Alonzo Logan. And it looks like she got married when she was about 15, 16 years old. Not unusual at that period of time. So we wouldn't necessarily consider that to be getting married really young. But it looks like her father may have, he seems to have been someone who she either would have met through her father's dealings and associations, or maybe somebody who her father really assisted, maybe as her husband, because he was kind of part of he was kind of there when Texas was voting whether or not to succeed. He seems to have had a personal relationship with Sam Houston, and there's kind of some information that's available about him. There's kind of some differences. So there's some information that I can go through public records and find things that may be filed with the county clerk. And then there's historical narratives that maybe other people have researched that we like to be able to share as like, these are narratives that we've seen, maybe not necessarily things that we've seen documented in public records in the same way. So just with a little grain of salt, kind of continued kind of this kind of big role in early Texas. And so her husband seems to have been kind of very involved with things that were going on in Austin as Texas was making decisions about whether or not to succeed. And he ended up leaving to fight in the Civil War for the Confederacy. It looks like shortly after their second son was born. So they had two sons, George and Jefferson, born very close together, and then he left. And for me, that's where the record of him kind of disappeared. I didn't see anything else about her husband in records as I was kind of researching her and trying to understand what property she had owned, where she might have lived, things like that. And then I found a record that mentioned her first husband having died, and it made a lot of sense to me that maybe he went, due to the timing, he probably went to go fight in the Civil War. He may have been killed in the Civil War. She would have had this tragic loss and two young sons to raise. And then I found out he didn't die. He did ultimately, but not at all the way that had kind of been described. So I did find a record that claimed that he was badly injured in the Civil War. He apparently fought in a few different very bloody battles. Had a head injury, had a hip injury, but he came back to Austin before 1865. So Georgetown and Austin, they're very close together. A lot of times we go, it's the Austin area. Remember, back at this point in time, it was a 30-mile wagon ride, horseback ride, or walk to go from Georgetown to Austin. So they were not particularly close together. And it wouldn't have been, if you lived in Austin and lived in Georgetown separately as a couple, it wouldn't have been you saw each other every day. That would have been like kind of too far to go. I think that's kind of a reasonable claim. Anne, would you say?
Yeah, for the most part. I will say people were more mobile than we think, though, too, in going back and forth. But yes, it's not a trek you would have made every day, for sure.
And so it looks like he was in Austin at least until the end of the Civil War, but I wasn't able to figure out what the nature of their relationship was following that. So we know that they had children together. Their sons would have been still very young at this point. I don't have any reason to think that she wasn't in Georgetown, but after the Civil War ended, he moved to Washington, D.C., and then ultimately married somebody else. And then came back to Texas by 1895. His wife there only lived about 4 years, and then she passed after their marriage. He was back in Texas by 1895 and went to live in the Confederate Veterans Home, and then is buried in Austin. And so he was here. He died in 1903, not much earlier, as I had assumed from what I had read in some of the documents I'd been researching through. So it turns out she also remarried. She married Samson G. Talbot in 1876. And I have a much clearer record of them separating. But, and help me understand if what might have happened here, because it looks like people just kind of went, oh, I'm just going to ignore that I'm married. It definitely does not look like what I would expect to see today.
And that honestly happens more than you think in that time period. If a relationship wasn't working out, because there's not really a lot of those checks and communication that we think of, oh, are you married to someone else? If you've mutually agreed to kind of separate, that's sort of their prerogative at that time period. And again, it goes back to that, it's kind of the Wild West still here. We're still having shootouts on the square. So there's not as much of necessarily the societal norms in this formalized documentation of sometimes marriages and living together, and sometimes the separations that occur. And so you will see this and people seem surprised, but again, we're still talking about humans. We really don't change that much. So it wasn't working. They went their separate ways and they tried with different spouses.
It seems like it didn't work out. And it seems like it didn't work out before her father passed. So George Washington Glasscock passed away in 1868, leaving her and her siblings as the heirs of a substantial amount of property and wealth. And so her brothers really got a lot of land. We're talking in the thousands and thousands of acres of land. And she seems to have at least inherited hundreds of acres around Georgetown. And so it's a little bit, so deed records at that point in time, if they're not in a city, if they're kind of out in the country or rural areas, sometimes the land that they're talking about is like, go to a stone mound, go to this tree. And it's like, I still have no idea where that was. We didn't have the county road system that we have today for reference points. There's a lot of things that we're not able to use as reference points the same way. So it requires a lot more research, a lot more detailed research to figure out where that was. So I couldn't tell you exactly where the property was that her father kind of conveyed to her. I do know that it was a lot. And I know that she was here. It seems pretty clear that she was here. Her sons were here from what I've been able to see. And so she would have been able to, off of that inheritance, she would have been able to support herself, even though her husband had left and gone to Washington, D.C. for whatever those reasons are. That could have been a mutual agreement. You know, he may have had a lot of difficulties coming back, especially if he was really injured. We're just not really clear. What we do know is that, and this is more clear, we do know that she married Samson G. Talbot in 1876. And we know that they also effectively divorced in 1881. And the reason that I know that more conclusively is because there is a filed record of agreement in which they partitioned their assets in what was effectively a divorce. And so it's where now she would have come into this marriage after inheriting property and money from her father, and she would have been a very wealthy lady. And you can kind of see in deed records, she was buying and selling a lot of land to different people for different purposes. And so she in this agreement where they partition their assets, it was very clear that she got the bulk of their kind of joint assets, being her property, not necessarily viewed as for her, for them at least, as his property. Now, legally, there may have been like, oh, well, you got married, so you and your husband have your property, but she seemed to kind of keep a kind of independent control of quite a bit of it, from what I can tell. And so following that, and it's funny that in later records, it wasn't that uncommon after somebody passed, if they hadn't written out a will or if they hadn't worked with an attorney, their estate might have gone to probate to decide, oh, wait, who are the heirs? Who is supposed to inherit? How is this supposed to work? Especially if they didn't have a clear will, or one that anybody could find. And so, so sometimes really people who knew the person who had passed really well would sign an affidavit. That would be a filed document, and it would be a legal document. It would be saying, hey, we knew this person for this amount of time. We know who they were married to. We know who their children were, and we're attesting to all of this information. That's sometimes the best way to be able to figure out family relationships or who inherited what, is sometimes in these affidavits that were signed and then filed in with the county clerk. And so there is an affidavit after she passed that she had divorced. And that was the way that it was phrased. She was divorced. And so this partition agreement that I saw is kind of effectively their divorce agreement that got filed to separate their assets. So after she did that, she bought a big old house where she lived through the end of her life. And then also her son and then grandson and then great-grandson inherited. So this is a house that was just to the south of the historic Williamson County Jail. It's right on Austin Avenue. So you see Brushy there. Austin Avenue used to be called Brushy Street, and it was for a long time. So you can see the 1916 map there on the left and the 1925 map there on the right. And this was a house that I believe had actually been built, I think it was by the Stubblefields, another really wealthy and kind of successful family in Georgetown. I believe the original portion of this house, the kind of the front two-story portion, may have been built as early as 1855. I'm not entirely sure, but it was definitely built before she bought it, although she may have added some of these later additions because she owned it by the early 1880s. And so this was her half of the block. And at one point in time, it turns out that the entire block was owned and occupied by single women. And so she kind of had this crew of neighbors who are also single ladies who were kind of right across the street from the jail and right between the jail and the downtown. And that would have probably been kind of an exciting place to be. You would have been able to see a lot of activity going on Austin Avenue and Main Streets. And so this is her house in 1934. You can see a little bit better photo there in the bottom right corner of the slide, but she passed in 1917, and she had given this house to her son Jefferson, who went by JD. JD passed, I believe, by 1924, and he had given this house to his son, who was newly married and had a new baby. So in 1934, I believe it was her grandson and his family who were living in this house. And the house stayed in the family for a long time, at least until the 1980s. Here we get kind of a zoom in view. So you can see this is another really large house. You can also tell that it's had a lot of additions to the rear over time, making a lot more space. This seems to have been a fairly small family in terms of like mom, dad, and son, but plenty of space for guests or neighbors or entertaining kind of would have made sense with the status of the Glasscock family in Georgetown for sure. And so the house was still there before 1991, but it looks like in the early to mid 1990s probably was about the time that it was demolished. And so again, we kind of wonder, why did we lose these historic structures? Why did these houses get torn down? A lot of times it's because we didn't have historic preservation practices or policies in place. And sometimes this house would have been, I think, if it was built around 1855 initially, this house is really getting old by the 1990s. And it looks like, I'm kind of making an educated guess a little bit. Looks like the house kind of needed a lot of work in order for it to be able to continue on with us. And so it looks like a decision was made to sell the house rather than to try to do that work. And then ultimately that house was demoed, it looks like in the kind of early to mid 1990s. So as you kind of pass by that corner, this gives you a little bit of an idea of what used to be there. And owned by Georgetown's own very prominent lady and one of our real estate developers, Elizabeth Glasscock. So that concludes our presentation for today. If we have any questions, we'd love to be able to answer those if we can. Nat, did we have any questions come up in the chat or on our Facebook Live?
No questions from the Facebook Live, but some gratitude for the work those we've done and some of our research. And we see that Preservation of Georgetown is chatting with us through Facebook Live, so thanks for following along. We do have two folks in the audience. I don't know if they have any questions. They haven't raised their hands. But if they do, they can use the chat function, or they can unmute their microphone if they have a question.
Thanks, Nat. So Nat, your microphone was a little bit fuzzy. Sometimes we have technical issues, so everybody who's familiar with us know we occasionally go technically amok. But if you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out, contact us. You can email us at historic at georgetown.org. If you want to see any of our past presentations, you can watch recorded videos. If you want to share this, we'll have it posted usually by the end of the week. On the front page, you can go to historic.georgetown.org and then link to the videos that we have posted. That's where our Zoom link lives. We also broadcast on the city's Facebook page as a live event on the first Tuesday of every month. And we're really pretty excited about next month. We usually kind of hold off on sharing what we're going to do, but I'm so excited about this one. I'm going to share it a little bit early. Next month, we're going to do a tour of Belford homes. And so in our presentation today, we talked a little bit about Belford built the Atkinson house for Lilburn and her husband, Charles. It was a different style than we normally associate with Charles Belford. And so what we think will be great fun for next month's presentation is to give you a virtual tour of Belford homes so that you can see the wide range of styles and materials that he used. Some of the houses I think will really surprise you. And then we also have some interesting business relationships that we want to be able to share with you that Belford had, just to kind of give you a better sense of the role a lumberyard played in the community at that point in time. Lumberyards are still really important. They're still like critical resources for development, for construction, for repairs, for home maintenance, all the important things to do with the historic structure. But at kind of earlier times in Georgetown, lumberyards were located right off of our square. The railroad spur came right into the lumberyards, and we've got some great photos of what that looks like. And so we're really excited to be able to share that with y'all next month. So thanks so much for joining us, and thank you as always for your knowledge and expertise and excellent photos that you provide. We really appreciate everything that the library does for our community. And do you have any kind of expectation on the library services changing or anything we need to share really quickly that people know about how the library works right now?
So we will be reopening Monday, March 8th for kind of a hybrid model service. If you want to do curbside pickup, you can come in the morning from 10 to noon. If you want to do grab and go, we'll be open from 2 to 6 Monday through Friday, and then on Saturdays 10 to 5. So curbside will only operate in the morning, and then grab and go in the afternoons.
Great. And is that information that y'all have posted on your website?
That will be available on our website. And if you've come to curbside recently, you've gotten a handout saying that and letting you know. So
expect some adjustments to the library services, good adjustments, I hope. So if you're planning to visit the library or if you need books and you just need to check in and see what best option is for you, please visit library.georgetown.org. And you can get that information and also get some contact information if you need it. So thank y'all again so much for joining us for our Tuesday Talks presentation. We really enjoyed March. We hope you enjoy celebrating Women's History Month as well as Texas Independence Day. And we'll see you in April on the first Tuesday for a tour of Belford Homes. Thanks so much.
Thank you, guys.